He once made grown men weep just by entering a room. Kang Do-yoon ruled Seoul's most feared syndicate not with brutality alone, but with a terrifying precision that left rivals no room to breathe. Then one night, fire took everything. His face, his confidence, his empire. Now his enemies are circling. His captains are whispering. And the woman who loves him is slowly disappearing while trying to save a man who has already decided he is not worth saving. This is the story of what happens when the most dangerous man in Seoul becomes his own worst enemy. Stay until the end. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Kang Do-yoon stopped being afraid of dying was the same night he discovered something far worse to be afraid of. It had been raining for 3 hours when the convoy left the Mapo district safe house. 4 vehicles rolling in tight formation through streets that emptied before them the way water parts around a stone. Do-yoon rode in the second car, seated behind Baek Hyun-suk, his consigliere of 11 years, and the only man alive who could say anything to Do-yoon's face without flinching first. The radio stayed off. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that settles over soldiers who know the city well enough to feel when something is wrong. Do-yoon felt it 4 blocks from the interchange. Not a sound, not a movement, just a heaviness in the air that pressed against the back of his jaw like a thumb pushing inward. He had learned to trust that pressure the way other men trusted weather forecasts. It had never been wrong. He leaned forward. "Stop the convoy." Hyun-seok turned his head. "We're 12 minutes from—" "Stop the convoy!" The driver's foot was moving toward the brake when the first car exploded. The blast punched through the wet air and shook the windows like cardboard. Do-yoon was already moving, shoulder into the door, hand gripping the frame, boots hitting asphalt before the vehicle fully stopped. His body ran on instinct older than thought. He had been trained by men who believed that hesitation was a moral failure, and somewhere in the decades since, that belief had fused with his spine. The third car was on fire. He could see it without looking directly at it because the light was violent and immediate, the kind that burns the image into your retinas before your brain has time to process what it means. Someone was screaming. One voice, high and broken, Shin Jae-won, barely 23, the youngest driver on the crew, who had joined the syndicate because his brother owed a debt and had stayed because Do-yoon had paid it off quietly and asked nothing in return. Do-yoon ran toward the fire. He heard Hyun-seok shouting behind him, something sharp and urgent that the wind and the roar of the secondary explosion ate whole. He didn't look back. The door of the burning car was crumpled inward and Jae-won was trapped behind it, his hands beating the window with diminishing force. Do-yoon hit the door with his shoulder once, twice, felt the metal resist, and then yield with a sound like a bone breaking the wrong way. He reached in and pulled. The second explosion came from below. The fuel line, someone told him later. He didn't remember the physics of it. What he remembered was heat. Not as temperature, but as weight, as something solid and crushing that pressed him into the ground and held him there while the world reduced itself to orange and black, and a ringing that replaced every other sound in existence. He remembered his hand still gripping Jae-won's jacket. He remembered deciding not to let go. He didn't remember anything after that for 11 days. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular quality of stillness that only exists in places where people are waiting to find out if someone will live. Zuri Adebayo Kang had been in that room for 9 of those 11 days, leaving only when the nursing staff physically escorted her to the small waiting area down the hall, where she would sit for exactly 40 minutes before returning. She was 34 years old. She had argued cases before international tribunals in Geneva, had cross-examined military officials in proceedings that made seasoned lawyers sweat through their collars, and had once spent 72 hours in a Nairobi holding facility because she refused to abandon a client the government wanted disappeared. She was not a woman who broke easily. She came close those 11 days. When Do-yoon finally surfaced from the sedation, the first thing he did was reach for her hand without opening his eyes. She gave it to him. She didn't cry because she had already used up what she had available, and because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had watched him closely for 6 years, that he would not want her to. The second thing he did, 40 minutes later, when a nurse adjusted the lighting and the room got brighter, was turn his face away from her. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She filed it somewhere in the back of her mind behind the immediate concerns. The skin grafts, the physical therapy schedule, the conversations with his doctors about what full recovery could realistically mean and what adjustments would be permanent. She was methodical when she was frightened. It was the only version of fear she had learned to make useful. He was in that hospital for 6 weeks. He never once let her see the left side of his face if he could avoid it. He angled himself toward windows, toward walls, toward shadows. He answered questions from his doctors with minimal words and deflected conversations with Hyun-suk about syndicate business with a flat patience that didn't invite argument. He thanked Zuri every day in a tone that was courteous and careful and held a distance in it that made her chest hurt. The Do-yoon she had married did not thank her. He argued with her. He challenged her. He once held an entire debate with her about contract law in the car on the way to a dinner party because he had read one article about it and decided he disagreed with her professional opinion, which he was spectacularly unqualified to have. He made her laugh in the most inconvenient moments. He never thanked her for simply being present because he had never been the kind of man who confused presence with sacrifice. The man in the hospital bed thanked her every day, and every time he did it, she felt him moving further away. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a building in Gangnam that Do-yoon had purchased through one of his legitimate real estate companies 3 years before the fire. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides and a wraparound terrace that looked out over Seoul in a way that made the city feel like something he personally owned, which, in certain practical senses, portions of it were. He had chosen it because Zuri had stood on that terrace for the first time and gone completely quiet in the way she only did when something moved her, and he had bought it the following morning. He came home to it from the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon and walked directly to the bedroom and closed the curtains. Zuri watched him do it. She stood in the main room with her hands at her sides while the afternoon light that had been filling the space was replaced by a premature dark, and she breathed through the tightness in her throat and said nothing. That was 18 months ago. The curtains in the main living area stayed open because she lived in those rooms and she needed daylight the way she needed water. The bedroom curtains stayed closed. The hallway mirror that had hung outside the master bathroom disappeared one morning. She found it in the storage room, face turned to the wall, and she left it exactly where it was. The small mirror on the inside of the medicine cabinet door had been removed entirely. She noticed the empty hinges when she reached for her toothpaste and stood there for a long moment before closing the cabinet and going about her morning. She never said a word about any of it. She was not sure what words existed that would not make things worse. And she was a woman who respected the weight of language enough to leave silence where silence was the more honest choice. Do-yoon managed the syndicate through phone calls, through Hyun-seok, through an elaborate relay of communication that allowed him to direct operations without setting foot outside the building. For the first several months, it had worked well enough. He was still sharp. His instincts for threat and opportunity hadn't been touched by the fire. If anything, the enforced stillness had sharpened his strategic thinking in ways that surprised even Hyun-seok, who had spent a decade learning not to be surprised by him. But leadership is not only strategy. Leadership is presence. It is the weight of a person in a room, the quality of silence that falls when they enter, the particular knowledge that travels through an organization from body to body that cannot be transmitted by phone or memo or relay. Do-yoon had built his organization on that presence. He had been relentless about it, showing up at funerals, at weddings, at hospital rooms when his men were hurt, at the dim bars where junior crew members drank and believed no one above them paid attention. He had known their names, their histories, their debts, their loyalties. He had made them feel seen, which was the only currency of leadership that never inflated. From the penthouse, he could direct. He could not be seen. And slowly, over 18 months, the difference began to matter. Hyun-seok came on the first Wednesday of each month. He was 51, lean in the way of men who had been athletic once, and then let the muscle convert itself to something leaner and more durable. He wore suits that fit him precisely and maintained an expression of professional calm that Do-yoon had watched him sustain through situations that would have unraveled most people. He had been with the organization for 19 years. Do-yoon trusted him the way you trust something you have pressure tested until you understand exactly where it bends and where it holds. He came in, sat across from Do-yoon in the main room, the room where the curtains stayed open because Zuri lived there, and spread a series of documents across the coffee table in the particular order that meant the news was not good, but Hyun Seok was not ready to say so directly yet. Do-yoon looked at the documents without touching them. Tell me. Hyun Seok was quiet for a moment. Then, the Seo brothers moved on the Yangcheon distribution network. 2 of our crew chiefs agreed to the meeting without authorization. Which 2? Hyun Seok told him. Do-yoon absorbed the names without visible reaction, which was how he absorbed everything that cost him something. And the meeting? Exploratory. Nothing signed, but they listened, which is already a signal. Hyun Seok paused. The problem isn't the Seo brothers. The problem is that our people are starting to ask questions that don't get asked in organizations where the leadership is visible. Do-yoon said nothing. What kind of questions? He said finally. The kind of question that already knows its answer. Hyun Seok's jaw tightened by a fraction. Whether you're coming back. The room was quiet. Outside the open windows, Seoul made its perpetual noise, traffic and construction, and the distant layering of 10 million lives pressing against each other in the compressed space of a modern city. Do-yoon had spent his entire adult life moving through that city, and now he sat 23 floors above it and let it be noise. Tell them I never left, Do-yoon said. Hyun Seok looked at him steadily. He was one of the few people who could. I have been telling them that for 18 months. They can hear the difference between something I believe and something I've been told to say. Do-yoon's hands were on the armrests, still. He was aware of the left side of his face the way a person is aware of a wound they've learned to stop touching. Not by forgetting it exists, but by building a constant small architecture of habit around it. He sat at angles. He controlled the lighting. He had become an expert at managing the geometry of every room he occupied. I'm handling it, he said. You're directing it, Hyun Seok said. There's a gap between those things right now, and the gap is getting wider. He gathered the documents. He straightened them with the particular care of someone who needed to do something with his hands while he chose his next words. Then he looked up. The Seo brothers have a meeting with the Yongsan leadership next week. If that alliance forms, we lose the northern corridors, and we don't get them back without a war that costs us more than territory. He paused. You need to be in that room, Do-yoon, not me. You. After Hyun Seok left, Do-yoon sat in the same chair in the same room with the curtains that Zuri kept open because she needed light the way she needed water, and he looked at the city he once walked through like he owned it, and he did not move for a long time. Zuri came home at 7 in the evening carrying a bag of groceries and the particular exhausted precision of someone who had spent 8 hours doing careful, important work that the world would likely never fully credit. She was a partner at a Seoul-based international law firm, had been for 3 years, though the international part of her practice had contracted significantly since the fire, a contraction she had managed through quiet internal arrangements rather than anything Do-yoon could directly object to. She cooked because cooking was one of the few activities that silenced the part of her mind that never stopped working. She moved through the kitchen with a concentrated efficiency and didn't speak, and Do-yoon sat at the kitchen island and watched her with an expression she had learned to interpret as his version of presence, the closest he now came to simply being in a room without also being somewhere else. Hyun Seok came, he said. I know. I saw the car. Silence. She added something to the pan. The smell changed and improved. He thinks I need to attend the Yongsan situation personally. Hyun Seok is usually right about things. Do-yoon's jaw shifted. Not always. Zuri set down the spoon she was holding and turned to look at him. Directly. She had made a decision early on that she would never stop looking at him directly, because the moment she began accommodating the angle he preferred, she would be confirming something she refused to confirm. He met her gaze and then looked away. South, toward a window. I'm managing it, he said. I know you are. She picked up the spoon again. I'm not saying you aren't. I'm saying there might be a difference between managing something and leading it. A long silence. She let it sit. Hyun Seok said something similar. Hyun Seok and I agree on very few things, she said, but we agree on that. Do-yoon said nothing for the remainder of the meal. He ate with the focused attention he gave everything, which was one of the things she had loved about him, the way he was never elsewhere when he was with her, or had not been, before. Now there was a room inside him that she couldn't find the door to, and she was beginning to understand that he had built it specifically so she couldn't. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes. She was standing at the sink when he spoke again, his voice carrying from behind her with a flatness that meant he had decided to say the thing rather than continue not saying it. If I walk into that room and every man in it looks at my face instead of my words, I've already lost. Zuri's hand stilled in the water.
They'll look, she said carefully. People look, and then they listen. And what they hear from you has always been worth listening to. That was before. She turned around. He was looking at the table. The left side of his face was in shadow. She could not tell whether by habit or by the room's actual geometry or whether after 18 months the distinction had ceased to exist.
Do-yoon. He looked up. Both sides of his face in the light now, and she held his gaze and didn't look away from anything she saw there because she had decided a long time ago that she would not. The men who respected you didn't respect your face, she said. They respected the fact that you were always the most prepared person in any room you entered, that you remembered details they thought no one noticed, that you showed up. She paused. The last part is the part that's changed. Something moved across his face. Not agreement? Not yet. Something that was trying hard not to be agreement because agreement meant movement, and movement meant the risk she could see him calculating, the precise, terrible arithmetic of a man trying to determine whether surviving exposure is less dangerous than the slow loss of everything that exposure protects. He stood up from the table and walked to the bedroom and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen in the clean-smelling aftermath of the meal and pressed her hands flat on the counter and breathed until the tightness in her chest resolved itself into something she could carry. And then she went to her desk and opened her laptop and did 3 more hours of work that the international community would benefit from, and that no one in her immediate life would ever fully see. 2 weeks later, Kang Seo-rin arrived without calling first. She was Do-yoon's older sister by 4 years, and the only person on earth who had always treated him like someone who could be wrong about things and survive the experience. She was a professor of criminal psychology at Yonsei University, and looked like someone who had made peace with the exact amount of nonsense she was willing to tolerate from the world, which was very little. She came in carrying a paper bag from the bakery 3 blocks away that Do-yoon had loved since he was 17, and she sat down across from him and put the bag on the table between them and looked at his face the way she had always looked at his face, which was without the performance of not looking that most people managed.
"You look terrible," she said. "Not because of the scars. You always looked better than was necessary. You look terrible because you've been inside for a year and a half and you're slowly turning into a person I don't recognize. Seo-rin, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here because Zuri called me, which means things have gotten to a point where she needed backup, and Zuri is not a woman who asks for backup." Do-yoon went very still. "She called you
3 days ago. She didn't tell me what to say. She just told me that the man she married was in that apartment and she couldn't reach him anymore." Seo-rin opened the bakery bag and set a pastry on the table in front of him with the matter-of-fact placement of someone performing a small kindness without sentimentality. "Do you know a man named Park Sung-chul?" Do-yoon's expression shifted. "Yes." "Tell me what you know about him." "Ran the Incheon waterfront operation in the 90s, old school. Survived a warehouse fire in 2004 that his people set to destroy evidence. He was inside when it went up. Burns on most of his upper body." A pause. "He rebuilt. Smarter than before. Retired on his own terms 7 years ago. He came to speak at a criminology conference I organized last spring," Seo-rin said. "He told the room that the fire took things from him that he had thought defined him, his appearance, his physical certainty, the particular way his body had always communicated authority to the people around him." She looked at her brother. "And then he said that rebuilding after that taught him the difference between leading with your body and leading with your mind. He said it was the most valuable lesson of his life. He said he would not trade the fire for anything." Silence. "That's a story someone tells when they've been through the other side of it," Do-yoon said, and his voice was flat in a way that was trying to be dismissal but didn't fully achieve it. "Yes," Seo-rin said simply. "It is." She stayed for 2 hours. She did not push. She ate the pastry she had brought and she talked about her students, and a paper she was writing, and a film she had seen that she thought was trying too hard. She let the conversation be ordinary because she understood, the way people who study human psychology understand, that ordinary is sometimes the most radical thing you can offer someone who has been living inside the extraordinary weight of their own crisis. When she left, Do-yoon sat alone in the room where the curtains stayed open because Zuri needed light, and he listened to the city outside. And for the first time in 18 months, he did not feel entirely certain that the man he had been before the fire was as completely gone as he had decided. It was not hope. It was something smaller and more dangerous than hope. It was the first crack in a wall he had spent 18 months building with great care and at enormous cost. And through it, cold air moved, and he sat with that and did not yet know whether it would save him or destroy what little he had left. The answer would come soon, and it would not arrive gently. The crack in the wall did not widen on its own. It took 3 more days of silence, 2 phone calls from Hyun-seok that Do-yoon let go to voicemail and then returned with clipped instructions that addressed the operational surface of things and nothing beneath it. And one morning, when he woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to Zuri breathe beside him and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes at 4 in the morning when the mind has exhausted every defense, that he was losing her. Not to another person, not to resentment or bitterness or the ordinary erosion of affection. He was losing her to the slow accumulation of absences, every conference she hadn't attended, every case she had quietly redirected, every morning she had rearranged her life around the shape of his damage without being asked and without complaint, which was somehow worse than if she had complained. She was disappearing while standing directly in front of him. He got up. He didn't turn on any lights. He walked to the main room where the curtains stayed open because she needed that, and he stood at the window and looked at Seoul at 4:15 in the morning. The way the city never fully darkened, the way light pooled in the wet streets below and made everything look like it was made of something more permanent than it was. And he tried to locate the version of himself that had once walked through those streets without calculating the geometry of every room first. He couldn't find him, but he could remember him, which was different from before. Before, even the memory had felt like someone else's history. Seoran's voice was in his head. Not the story about Park Sung-chul that had landed and then sat quietly in a corner of his mind where he hadn't yet decided what to do with it. It was something simpler she had said when she was leaving, standing at the door with her coat already on, delivering it the way she delivered most true things, without ceremony or particular emphasis. The men who still follow you, she had said, aren't following a face. They're following a decision you haven't made yet. He stood at the window until the sky started to change color. Then he went to the kitchen, made coffee, and called Hyun-seok at 5:45 in the morning. Hyun-seok answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "The Yongsan meeting," Do-yoon said. "When?" A brief silence on the other end, the kind that isn't empty. "Thursday, 2 days." "Where?" "The Mapo office. Neutral enough that they'll come. Close enough to our territory that it signals we're not conceding anything." "Who's in the room for them?" "Choi Dong-hwan, maybe one of the Song brothers. They'll bring muscle but keep it outside." Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. He could hear Hyun-seok breathing on the other end, very carefully, not asking the question that the entire phone call was built around. "I'll be there," Do-yoon said. Another silence, longer this time. "Do-yoon, don't say anything about it. Just set it up." "Already set up," Hyun-seok said. "I've been keeping it open for 2 weeks in case you—" He stopped. "I'll send a car. I'll drive myself." He hung up and stood in the kitchen with his coffee going cold in his hand and tried to assess whether what he felt was resolve or just the particular exhaustion of having run out of alternatives. He wasn't certain there was a meaningful difference. He had made most of the best decisions of his life from exactly that position. He did not tell Zuri that morning. She left at 7:30, carrying her laptop bag and the careful composure she wore outside the apartment like a second skin. Professional, unhurried, giving nothing away. She kissed him on the cheek, the left cheek, the way she always did, deliberately, without making anything of it, and he stood in the hall and watched her go and told himself he would tell her when she came home. The day moved strangely. He spent the morning on calls, operational details, a supply chain issue in the Incheon corridor that one of his logistics captains had been managing badly for 3 months, a personnel problem in the Mappo crew that had been brewing since before the fire and had finally surfaced as something that needed direct resolution. He handled them with the same precise attention he had always brought to the mechanics of running an organization this size. The work had never been the problem. The work was the one thing the fire hadn't touched. At noon, Hyun-suk arrived in person, which was not scheduled. Do-yoon looked at him from across the main room. "What?" Hyun-suk closed the door behind him. He was carrying nothing, which meant whatever he had come to say wasn't something he wanted documented. "There's a development." "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." A pause. Lee Sung-jun made contact with the SEO organization yesterday. The name landed with a particular weight. Lee Sung-jun had been Do-yoon's operations director for 7 years. Not a captain, above that. The man responsible for the logistical architecture of everything the syndicate moved and stored and controlled. He had visited Do-yoon in the hospital 3 times in the first month, and then the visits had stopped. A fact Do-yoon had filed without analysis at the time because he had been filing many things without analysis in those early weeks. "What kind of contact?" Do-yoon said. "A dinner, private. Sung-jun's people arranged it, which means it wasn't casual and it wasn't the Seo brothers reaching out to him." Hyun-suk's expression was the careful neutral of a man delivering news he knows will be received like a blade. "He initiated it?" Do-yoon said nothing. His hands were on the armrests. "Still. What did they discuss? And I don't have full intelligence on that yet. I have confirmation of the meeting, the location, and who was present. Details are coming." Hyun-suk paused. "But the fact of the meeting is already a problem, regardless of what was said." "Lee Sang-jun has been with the organization since before you were," Do-yoon said, and his voice was very flat and very even. "Yes. He recruited 12 of the best logistics people we have. He built the Incheon model from scratch." "Yes. If he's talking to the Seo brothers, it's not because he's built a better offer somewhere." Do-yoon's jaw tightened incrementally. "It's because he's decided the offer I represent isn't what it used to be." Hyun-suk said nothing, which was his version of confirmation. The silence in the room had a specific quality, not empty, but dense, the way silence gets when it's carrying something neither person wants to be the one to say first. Outside, Seoul made its noise. A delivery truck somewhere below. The distant compression of a city that never stopped running regardless of what was happening in any particular room above it. "You should have told me sooner," Do-yoon said. "I'm telling you now because now I have confirmation. Before yesterday, I had inference and suspicion, and I don't bring you inference." Hyun-suk's voice was steady. "You taught me that. I taught you a lot of things when I was operating with complete information, and you were bringing it to me in real time." A pause that carried its own weight. "That model requires me to be in the field." "Yes," Hyun-suk said. "It does." Do-yoon looked at him steadily. The left side of his face was in the light. He had stopped managing the geometry of the room sometime in the past hour without noticing. "Thursday still holds." "Thursday still holds. Get me everything on the Sang-jun meeting by tomorrow morning. Full intelligence, not inference. By tonight if I can." After Hyun-suk left, Do-yoon sat for a long time without moving. Lee Sang-jun. 7 years. The man had been at Do-yoon's right hand through 3 territorial wars, 2 federal investigations that had gone nowhere, and 1 internal betrayal 6 years ago that Sang-jun himself had helped expose and resolve with a ruthlessness that had impressed even Do-yoon. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Bundang. He coached his younger daughter's school football team on Saturday mornings, a fact Do-yoon knew because he made it his business to know the lives of the people who held the load-bearing structures of his organization. He had stopped knowing those lives 18 months ago. That, he understood now, sitting in the room where Zuri kept the curtains open, was the real damage. Not the face, not the territory, or the perception or the questions his captains were asking in rooms he wasn't in. The real damage was the distance he had put between himself and the human architecture of everything he had built. And distance, in an organization that ran on loyalty and presence and the specific gravity of being known, was the most dangerous thing in the world. Zuri came home at 7. He was in the kitchen again. He had taken to occupying rooms that gave him something functional to do.
and she came in and set down her bag and looked at him with the attention she always paid, the kind that took inventory without appearing to. "You called Hyun-suk this morning," she said. Not a question. "He came by this afternoon."
She went to the refrigerator. She wasn't performing casual. She was genuinely moving through the ordinary motions of the evening while also listening with complete attention, which was one of the things about her that had never ceased to impress him. She could hold two things simultaneously in a way that most people couldn't manage even sequentially. "Thursday," he said. "I'm going to the Yongsan meeting." She stilled with the refrigerator door open. Just for a moment. Then she closed it and turned around and looked at him. "Okay," she said. "That's all. That's all." A pause. Do you want to talk through it?" "No?" He met her eyes. "Yes." A beat. Sangjun is talking to the Seo brothers. He watched the shift move across her face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration of someone who had already been worrying about something and has just received confirmation that the worry was correctly sized. She was a lawyer. She knew how to receive bad information without letting her reaction become the center of the conversation. "How long?" she said. "I don't know yet. Long enough to arrange a private dinner." She came to the island and sat across from him. The light above them was the warm overhead light she preferred in the evenings, and in it he was aware of his face the way he was always aware of it. The geography of damage on the left side, the tightness of the grafted skin, the way the left eye didn't quite open to the same width as the right anymore. He was aware of it, and he did not angle away from her, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him, which was directly and without performance. "He's not the only one," she said. "I know. He's just the most significant one so far." "I know, Zuri." She folded her hands on the island's surface, quiet for a moment. "When you go Thursday, what's the objective? Just presence, or are you going to move on the Sangjun situation at the same time?" "Presence first. The Sangjun situation requires more information." He paused. "I don't make moves on 7-year relationships based on one dinner I wasn't at." "Fair." She looked at him. "Do-yoon." "What?" "I need you to know that I'm—" She stopped. He was choosing words with the careful precision of someone who understood their weight. "I'm glad you called Hyun-seok. I'm glad about Thursday." A pause. "And I need you to know that what I sacrificed this past 18 months, I need you to know I made those choices. You didn't take anything from me." Something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the physical damage. "You declined the Geneva conference," he said. "Yes." "The Nairobi proceedings." "Yes." "The research fellowship you spent 4 years building toward." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew about the fellowship." "I know about everything that matters." His voice was flat but not cold. The flatness of someone holding something carefully rather than someone who doesn't feel it. "I know what you gave up. I know you didn't tell me because you didn't want me to carry it, and I've been letting you do that for 18 months. Zuri's jaw moved slightly. She looked down at her folded hands and then back up at him. "I didn't do it so you'd owe me something," she said. "I know. That's the part I can't forgive myself for." He held her gaze. "After Thursday, you call Geneva. You tell them you're available for the fall proceedings. Whatever you need to make it work, we make it work." "Do you—" "That's not a request." A silence. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not fully decode, which was unusual. He could generally read her with high accuracy. And then she nodded once, a small clean movement that meant she had accepted something she was still processing. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They ate dinner. They talked about other things. A case she was working, the building's elevator that had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks, a film Seo-rin had mentioned that they should watch, and probably wouldn't. The ordinary accumulation of a shared life. He was aware of it more acutely than usual, the way you become aware of the specific weight of something when you've come close to losing it. Wednesday arrived the way significant days always do, indistinguishable from any other until you're already inside it. Hyun-seok's intelligence report on the Sangjun meeting came through at 6 in the morning. Do-yoon read it at the kitchen island with his coffee and the specific internal stillness
he had always been able to find before something that required his full capacity. The details were worse than he had allowed himself to expect.
The dinner had not been exploratory. Sang-jun had come with a prepared presentation. Not documents, nothing that could be recovered or used, but a verbal architecture of transition so detailed and considered that it had clearly been developed over months. He had proposed a structure by which the CO brothers could absorb the syndicate's logistics network wholesale, not a hostile takeover, a negotiated dissolution. He had presented himself as the operational continuity the CO organization would need to make the integration work. He had, in other words, offered to deliver everything Do-yoon had built in exchange for a position and a guarantee. He had not, according to Hyun-seok's source, said a single word against Do-yoon personally. He had been clinical. He had framed it as an organizational evolution in response to changed leadership capacity. He had made the argument with the same precise competence he had applied to everything he'd ever done inside the syndicate, which made it somehow more corrosive than if he'd simply been treacherous. Do-yoon put down the phone and sat with that for several minutes. Then he called Hyun-seok. Who else in the room knew? Two of Sang-jun's direct reports were present. Both of them are operational. They have too much skin in the current structure to switch easily. I think they were there as witnesses, not collaborators. Think. I'm working on confirmation. Get me names of every person in the organization who has had direct contact with Sang-jun in the past 3 months. Do-yoon's voice was very quiet. That specific quietness that had always been more alarming to people who knew him than volume would have been. Not indirect. Direct. By end of day. By noon. He was pulling on his jacket when Zuri appeared in the hall, dressed for work, reading something on her phone that she folded away when she saw his expression. What happened? She said. Nothing that changes Thursday. She looked at him. Do-yoon? Sang-jun's been planning this for months, possibly longer. He met her eyes. I should have seen it. I was inside for 18 months, and I missed it building. Her expression shifted through several things quickly. You couldn't have known. I could have, he said, and his voice was not self-pity, and it was not anger, and it was not the particular broken quality of someone looking for comfort. It was a man making an accurate assessment of a failure and choosing not to dress it up as anything else. I was here. I was managing from a distance and telling myself it was the same thing as being present, and it isn't. It was never the same thing, and I knew that, and I stayed here anyway. She was quiet. She did not disagree with him, which was one of the reasons he trusted her. So what do you do with that? She said. Tomorrow I walk into a room and I show every person in it that the organization is exactly what it has always been. He straightened his jacket. Tonight, I find out how far the damage goes. He was at the door when she spoke again. Be careful. He looked back at her. The morning light was coming through the open curtains behind her, and she was standing in it with her bag over her shoulder and her eyes steady on his face, both sides of it, the way she always looked at him. Always, he said. And he didn't mean it the way careful people mean it. He meant it the way people who have survived fire mean it, not as a promise of safety, but as a statement of intention, which is a different and more honest thing. He left. The elevator descended. The lobby opened onto the street. He stepped outside for the first time without purpose in 18 months, and Seoul hit him like a physical force, noise and diesel exhaust, and the compressed smell of 10 million people living their lives at volume. And he stood on the pavement for a moment with the left side of his face in the full morning light, where anyone passing could see it, where nothing was managed or angled or controlled. A woman walked past with a child and didn't look at him. A delivery man crossed the street without breaking stride. An old man sat at the bus stop with a newspaper and glanced up and glanced away with the comprehensive indifference of someone who had already seen everything the city had to offer. Do-yoon stood there for 30 seconds. Then he walked to his car. He had a full day before Thursday. He intended to use every hour of it. What he did not know, what Hyun-seok did not yet know, and would not know until 7 that evening, when a junior contact inside the CO organization made a panicked call, was that Lee Sang-jun had moved the timeline forward, that the CO brothers had received word that Do-yoon was returning to active leadership and had decided they could not allow the Yongsan meeting to happen, and that somewhere in the city that had just washed over Do-yoon like a wave, something had already been set in motion that would force his hand before he was ready, in a way he had not prepared for, with consequences that could not be managed from a distance or from a penthouse or from anywhere except the center of the storm itself. The call came at 7:14 in the evening. Do-yoon was in the MAPO office, not the public-facing real estate firm that occupied the building's first 3 floors, but the 4th floor, which had no signage and no elevator access from the lobby, and which served as the operational nerve center for everything the syndicate moved and decided and protected. He had been there since 2 in the afternoon, working through the list Hyun-suk had compiled, cross-referencing contact patterns against operational decisions made over the past 6 months, building the picture the way he had always built pictures, not from the center outward but from the edges inward, because the edges were where the truth lived before it was ready to be seen. The picture was not good. He was standing at the long table with 3 of his most trusted crew chiefs, men who had been with him long enough that their loyalty had been tested and had held, when Hyun-seok came through the door with his phone already extended and an expression Do-yoon had seen on his face exactly twice before in 11 years. Both previous times, it had preceded something that required immediate and irreversible action. "Take it," Hyun-seok said. "His name is Park Min-soo. He's a runner for the SEO organization's Eastern operations. He asked for you specifically." Do-yoon took the phone. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was young and tight with the specific compression of someone who is frightened but has decided that being frightened is less important than saying what they called to say. "They know you're coming Thursday. They've known since yesterday morning." Do-yoon's eyes moved to Hyun-seok. Hyun-seok gave a small, precise nod that meant he was already thinking the same thing. "How?" "Someone inside your organization gave them the meeting details, time, location, who's attending, what you're planning to propose." A pause. A sound like the person on the other end moving through a space quickly. "They're not going to meet with you. They're planning to use Thursday to send a message." "What kind of message?" "The permanent kind." Another pause. "I'm telling you this because Lee Sang-joon told my boss that once the transition is complete, there won't be positions for people like me. I've got a family. I'm not—" The voice broke slightly and then steadied. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I want out before it lands, and I figure warning you is worth something." Do-yoon was quiet for 3 seconds. "Where are you right now?" "Somewhere I won't be for long. Stay on this number." Do-yoon handed the phone back to Hyun-seok with a look that communicated a complete set of instructions without requiring words. Hyun-seok was already moving. The 3 crew chiefs at the table had heard enough to understand the shape of what was happening even without the details. Do-yoon looked at each of them in turn, not a long look, just enough to take the read he needed. These 3 were clean. He was certain of it with the particular certainty that comes not from analysis but from the accumulated knowledge of watching men under pressure across a decade of situations that tested whether they were who they presented themselves to be. "Leave," he said. "Go home. Don't communicate with anyone in the organization tonight who isn't sitting in this room. I'll contact you directly before Thursday." They left without questions. That alone told him something about the difference between the men who had stayed genuinely loyal and the ones who had begun calculating alternatives. Hyun-seok came back and 4 minutes later. He closed the door. "The source checks out," he said. "Min-soo is real. His position in the SEO operation is real, and the detail he gave about the transition plan matches intelligence I've been developing independently." He set his phone on the table face down. "Which means the leak is real." "I know the leak is real." Do-yoon's voice was very quiet. "I've been sitting here for 5 hours looking at contact patterns, and I already know where it came from." Hyun-seok looked at him. "Tell me." "Not yet." Do-yoon pulled out a chair and sat down, which was unusual. He generally stood when he was working through something operational. But sitting was a choice too, and he made it deliberately because what he was about to do required the kind of stillness that standing doesn't allow. Pull the communication logs for the past 90 days. Every channel. And pull the meeting coordination records for Thursday. Who knew the specific details? Time and location and attendee list? Not just that a meeting was happening. That list is short. "I know how short it is." Hyun-seok sat down across from him. He folded his hands on the table in the way he did when he was preparing to say something he had already turned over several times before deciding it had to be said. "Do-yoon, if the source on Thursday is who I think you think it is, don't say the name yet." Then we have a problem that goes beyond Thursday. We have a problem that goes back potentially to the convoy. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Do-yoon did not react visibly. His face did not change. His hands on the table did not move. But something shifted in the quality of his stillness. A deepening, the way water goes quiet over very deep places, that Hyun-seok had learned to recognize as the most dangerous version of his attention. "Say what you're saying," Do-yoon said. "The ambush on the convoy 18 months ago." Hyun-seok's voice was level and careful, the voice of a man delivering something he wishes he didn't have to deliver. "We investigated it internally. We concluded it was the Busan cartel acting on intelligence they'd developed independently. We closed the file." He paused. "I never fully closed it in my own mind. The timing of the attack was too precise. The route we took that night was decided 4 hours before we left, in a meeting with 6 people present. I remember the meeting. 5 of those 6 people are above suspicion based on everything that's happened since. The 6th, I pulled back from because I couldn't build a case and I didn't want to bring you inference." A pause that carried genuine weight. "I think I was wrong to wait." Do-yoon looked at his consigliere of 11 years across the table. "Who was the 6th person in the room?" Hyun-seok said the name. "Lee Sang-jun." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a truth arriving in a space that has been unconsciously prepared for it. The specific quality of recognition that feels less like discovery than like finally being allowed to see what you already knew without knowing you knew it. Do-yoon breathed in, breathed out, looked at the table surface, then looked up. "The fire," he said. "If Sang-jun fed the route to the Busan cartel, then the fire wasn't a response to anything I did. It wasn't a rival organization making a calculated move. It was—" He stopped. Something was moving through him that he was not going to name in this room, or possibly anywhere. It was someone inside my own structure trying to remove me. "And when the attempt failed and you survived," Hyun-seok said quietly, he adjusted his strategy. He waited. He watched you withdraw. And then he began building the architecture for a negotiated transfer, because he'd already decided once that you needed to be gone, and the belief doesn't disappear just because the method failed. Do-yoon stood up. He walked to the window. This office had windows that faced east toward the Han River, and in the nighttime the river was a dark band between the lit shores, and it looked like a wound running through the body of the city. He looked at it and breathed, and let the magnitude of what Hyun-seok had just said settle into his body the way physical damage settles. Not all at once, but in layers. The shock first, and then beneath it the structural implications, and beneath that something that would take much longer to fully arrive and could not be processed here. 7 years. Lee Sang-jun had spent 7 years inside Do-yoon's organization, inside his trust, inside the specific category of person that Do-yoon classified as essential, the load-bearing kind, the kind whose loyalty he had never questioned because it had never given him reason to question it. He had coached his daughter's football team on Saturday mornings. He had visited Do-yoon in the hospital. 3 times in that first month, he had come and sat and said the right things, and Do-yoon had registered his presence in the category of loyalty without examining it further because he was still in the sedation fog, and because some part of him, some part that he would now need to reckon with completely, had not wanted to examine it. A man who tried to have you killed does not visit you in the hospital. Except that sometimes he does, Do-yoon thought, because visiting you confirms that the attempt failed, and because the visit itself becomes part of the alibi, and because the audacity of the gesture is its own kind of cover. He turned away from the window. "Where is Sang-jun tonight?" he said. "His home in Bundang, as far as we know." "Don't move on him tonight." Hyun-seok's expression shifted slightly. "Do-yoon," I said, "don't move on him." His voice was not loud. It had the specific quietness that closed down argument. "If we move on him tonight, the Seo brothers know by morning that the intelligence network they've been building with him is compromised. They accelerate whatever they're planning for Thursday, or they go completely dark, and we lose the ability to see what they're doing." He came back to the table. "Right now, Sang-jun doesn't know we know. That's the only advantage we have, and I'm not burning it for the satisfaction of moving fast." "Iwo? Hyun-seok was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "What do you need?" I need the full network map of every communication Songjun has had with the CO organization. Not summary. Full. I need to know who else inside our structure has been in contact with him about this, whether willingly or as an unwitting source. And I need to know the exact nature of what's planned for Thursday, because the source said permanent, and I want to understand what that means operationally before I decide how to respond to it. I can have most of that by morning. Have all of it by morning. Hyun-seok stood. He picked up his phone. He paused at the door with the particular hesitation of someone who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether tonight is the right time to say it. He decided it was. Do-yoon, the convoy. Chaewon was in that car. He paused. You went back for him. I know. Songjun knew you'd go back. That's who you are. It's not a secret inside the organization. Anyone who's been watching you long enough knows that you go back. A pause. I think the placement of Chaewon in that vehicle may not have been coincidental. The implications of that landed without dramatic effect, which was somehow worse than if they'd been dramatic. It meant the trap had been built with precise knowledge of his character. It meant someone had used his own loyalty as the mechanism of his destruction. It meant that the best version of himself, the version that ran toward the burning car, had been the target. Go, Do-yoon said. Get me what I need. Hyun-seok left. Do-yoon sat alone in the Mappo office with the lights of the Han River in the east window, and the communication logs spread across the table, and the full weight of what the last 7 years actually were pressing down on him with a completeness that left no room for anything except clarity. He called Zuri at 9:45. She answered immediately. Where are you? Mappo office, I'm going to be here for a while. A pause. She was reading something in his voice. She always was. How bad? Bad. He paused. I need you to do something for me tonight. Tell me. Go to Seorin's, take what you need for a night. Don't tell anyone where you're going except me, and don't take the usual route. His voice was very even. This is a precaution. I don't have specific information that you're at risk. I'm being careful. The silence on her end was the silence of someone processing a significant data point with the speed and precision of a trained legal mind. Songjun, she said, don't say anything else on this line. Okay. A pause, just one. Do-yoon, whatever you find out tonight, I know. Come back. I will. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand and breathed through the specific sensation in his chest that was not fear and not grief, but some compound of both that didn't have a clean name and that he would not spend time trying to identify because there was work to do, and he had always been better at work than at naming things. Hyun-seok came back at 2 in the morning. He came back with a man Do-yoon didn't recognize. Mid-30s, unremarkable in the specific way of people who have cultivated unremarkability as a professional skill, carrying a laptop and the alert exhaustion of someone who has been doing rapid forensic work for several hours. This is Cho, Hyun-seok said. He handles our digital intelligence. He's been in the Mappo Communications archive since 10 o'clock. Cho set the laptop on the table and turned it so Do-yoon could see the screen. I'm going to show you 3 things, he said, with the directness of someone who understands that the person across the table doesn't need context or softening. The first is a pattern of information transfer going back 14 months. The second is the financial architecture underneath it. The third is something I found that I don't think anyone was supposed to find. Do-yoon looked at the screen. Show me. The first thing was the communication pattern. Not direct messages, nothing that unsophisticated, but a series of operational decisions and their timing relative to SEO organization movements over 14 months. Every time Do-yoon's organization had prepared a significant territorial move, the SEO brothers had pre-positioned to counter it. 14 months of what had looked like competitive intelligence had been, in precise retrospect, a pipeline. Songjun at the source. The second thing was money. A series of accounts routed through 3 shell structures in jurisdictions Do-yoon recognized from his own legitimate real estate operations. Songjun had built his financial exit using architecture he had learned from watching Do-yoon construct his legitimate holdings, which had a particular quality of violation that Do-yoon absorbed without comment. The third thing was a document. Cho had found it in a partition of the communication archive that had been improperly secured, not deleted, not encrypted, just misfiled in a location that suggested it had been accessed from inside the Mapo office itself, possibly during a period when Sangjun had been here, in this room at this table, in the weeks before the fire. It was a contact sheet. Names, positions, and beside each name, a notation in a shorthand that Cho had spent an hour decoding. The notations were assessments, vulnerability, leverage, reliability. A cold actuarial document of exactly which people inside Do-yoon's organization could be turned, at what cost, and through what method. Do-yoon's name was at the top of the document. Beside it, in Sangjun's shorthand, irreplaceable, removal only. Do-yoon looked at that phrase for a long moment. Not betrayal, not corruption, not ambition that had simply gotten out of hand. Someone had made a calculated decision, years ago, possibly before the convoy, and possibly before even that Do-yoon could not be managed or leveraged or turned, and had therefore concluded that the only viable path was removal. Everything else had followed from that single assessment. The convoy, the fire. The 18 months of withdrawal that Sangjun had watched and presumably encouraged through the precise inaction of a man who understood that his target was doing the work for him. The architecture of the Seo negotiation, which had been built on the premise that Do-yoon would not return, and which would collapse if he did. Thursday was not a negotiation that had been compromised. Thursday was a trap set for a man Sangjun had believed was already finished. He was wrong, Do-yoon said aloud, and he was not speaking to Hyun-seok or to Cho. He was speaking to the document on the screen and to the version of Lee Sang-jun that had written it and to the 18 months that had almost proved it correct. Hyun-seok was watching him carefully. What do you want to do? Do-yoon closed the laptop. He stood. He buttoned his jacket in the precise, automatic way of a man who has decided something and is moving his hands through the ordinary motions of preparation while his mind completes the architecture of what comes next. Thursday still happens, he said. Hyun-seok blinked. Once. Do-yoon, they're planning. I know what they're planning. Thursday still happens. He looked at his consigliere. But not the meeting we told them we were having. We go in with full operational readiness. We use the meeting as the trigger point. We let them come to us believing they have the advantage, and we take the ground out from under them while they're still deciding how to use it. That requires all captains mobilized by tomorrow night. Then mobilize them. And Sangjun comes to Thursday. He'll come because he believes he's coordinating the handover. He'll come because not coming would signal that something has changed, and right now he thinks nothing has changed. Do-yoon picked up his phone from the table. He's going to walk into that room believing he's ending something. I'm going to let him believe that right up until the moment he understands that he's been walking towards something that's been waiting for him since the convoy. Hyun-seok looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face was complex, relief and apprehension in equal measure. The face of a man who has been waiting for the return of something he had begun to fear was permanently gone and is now confronted with the reality of it and finds that it is both better and more dangerous than the waiting had been. You're sure? Hyun-seok said. No, Do-yoon said, but I'm moving anyway, which is the same thing in practice. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the room. The table, the laptop, the window, with the Han River dark in the east. He thought about Jae-won, 23 years old, beating the window with diminishing force. He thought about his own hand holding the jacket and deciding not to let go. He thought about the fire and the hospital and 18 months of curtains closed against the daylight, and a man who had stood in his organization for 7 years and assessed him as irreplaceable, and then spent those same years methodically working toward his end. He thought about Zuri at Seorin's apartment tonight, having understood from 5 words on a phone call that something had broken open, having said come back with the simplicity of someone who means it as both a request and a demand. He was going to come back, but first he was going to walk into the center of the thing that had been trying to finish what the fire had started, and he was going to make sure that when it was over, there was no version of Thursday that anyone in Seoul would confuse with a loss. The elevator descended. The lobby, the street. Seoul at 2 in the morning was a different city than Seoul at 5. Quieter, more honest, stripped of the daytime performance of normality. He walked to his car in the cold air with the left side of his face in the ambient light of the city, and he did not manage the geometry of anything. There was one thing he still didn't know. One piece that Hyun Seok's intelligence and Cho's forensics and the contact sheet with its cold notations had not answered. He knew what Sang Jun had done, and he knew what Sang Jun was planning, and he knew that Thursday would be the end of it one way or another. What he did not yet know was whether the Seo brothers' plan for Thursday involved only him, or whether they had calculated that the most efficient way to ensure Do-yoon's permanent removal was to eliminate not just the man, but the person whose presence in his life had been the only thing standing between him and the darkness he had nearly disappeared into. Whether, in other words, Zuri was already part of what they had planned. He called Hyun Seok from the car before he'd driven 2 blocks. "Zuri," he said, "I need to know if she's in the plan." Hyun Seok was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was long enough to tell Do-yoon that the question had already occurred to him. "I don't have confirmation either way. Get it, tonight, whatever it costs." Do-yoon's voice was flat and very cold and carried the specific quality of a man who has located the precise thing he is willing to go to any length for and is no longer interested in calibrating that length. "If she's in the plan, I need to know before sunrise." "Understood. And Hyun Seok." A pause. "Move her. Don't tell her I asked you to. Tell Seo-rin it's a precaution. Move them both to the Songpa safe house and put 2 people on the door who aren't connected to anyone Sang-jun has touched in the past 14 months. I'll handle it personally." Do-yoon hung up and drove. He drove without destination for 20 minutes through the nighttime city because driving was the only physical activity available to him at 2:30 in the morning that gave his body something to do while his mind completed the work it needed to complete. He had always been like this. The thinking that mattered happened in motion, in the space between decisions where the body moves on instinct and the conscious mind is freed from the performance of arriving at conclusions and can simply arrive at them. By the time he came back to the Mappo office, he knew what Thursday looked like. All of it. Every position, every timing, every contingency and its counter. He had run the full operation in his mind during those 20 minutes, and the architecture was clean. There were risks he couldn't eliminate. There always were. But they were the kind of risks that existed in every operation he had ever run, and that he had learned to carry the way you carry weight that has been properly distributed. Present, but not destabilizing. The risk he could not carry the same way was Zuri. He sat in the car in the Mappo parking structure for a moment with the engine off and the silence pressing in from all sides, and allowed himself to be aware of that fully. Not to process it or resolve it, just to let it be as large as it actually was, because he had spent 18 months managing his own damage by making it smaller than it was, and he was done with that particular strategy. Then he got out of the car and went back upstairs and worked until dawn. Matza. Thursday arrived gray and cold, with a low-pressure system that had moved in from the west overnight and turned the sky the color of old concrete. Do-yoon was already at the Mappo office when the light changed, having not slept, having consumed enough coffee to be alert without the chemical edge that came from too much of it, sitting at the table where the contact sheet had been, and which was now cleared and replaced with a different set of documents, operational positions, timing charts, the architectural blueprint of the building where the meeting was scheduled, which Hyun Seok had obtained through the legitimate real estate arm with a phone call at 6 in the morning to a contact who asked no questions. Hyun Seok arrived at 7 with confirmation on 2 things. The first, Zuri was not in the Seo brothers' plan. She had not been included in the operational brief that Sang-jun had provided them. Whether this was because Sang-jun had assessed her as peripheral, or because targeting a civilian lawyer of her international profile carried risks he hadn't wanted to absorb, was unclear and ultimately irrelevant. She was not a target. She was at the Songpa safe house with Seo-rin and 2 men on the door, and she was safe, which was the only variable in the entire operation that Do-yoon had not been able to control through strategy alone, and which was now resolved. He breathed once, slowly, and moved on. The second thing Hyun Seok confirmed: the Seo brothers' plan for Thursday was not a public action. They were not going to move on the street or create something that would attract federal attention. They were going to use the meeting itself, specifically the period of arrival, when Do-yoon's security would be managing the transition from vehicle to building and the team would be most dispersed. A tight window, professional, the kind of plan that had been assembled by people who understood operational timing. How many? Do-yoon said. 6 exterior, 2 inside the building already, placed as maintenance workers yesterday afternoon. Hyun-seok set the intelligence summary on the table. Choi Dong-hwan is coordinating from a vehicle 2 blocks east. The Seo brothers themselves are not present. Of course not. Do-yoon looked at the building blueprint. The 2 inside positions. 3rd floor stairwell and the main lobby service corridor. And Sang-jun, attending as planned. He'll arrive with his own security, separate from the CO positioning. He's presenting himself as a neutral facilitator. Hyun-seok's jaw tightened fractionally. He's going to walk in believing he's there to manage the transition announcement. He's going to walk in believing I'm walking into a box, Do-yoon said. Let him believe it until he's in the room. He stood and looked at the blueprint and the position markers Hyun-seok had drawn in red and the timing windows marked in the margins, and he felt the specific quality of focus that had always come over him before operations. Not calm exactly, but something denser than calm, a compression of everything irrelevant until only the geometry of the problem remained. He had missed this. He had not let himself know how much he had missed it. The captains, he said, all 9, confirmed and positioned as of 6 this morning. Hyun-seok paused. When you walked into this office 2 days ago, it was the first time they'd seen you in person in 18 months. I want you to know, not one of them hesitated. Not for a second. Do-yoon looked at him. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make less of it. Let's go, he said. Bishet. The convoy left the Mapo office at 9:45. 3 vehicles, different from the standard formation. Different route. The kind of variables that matter when the people planning against you have had access to your operational patterns for 14 months. Do-yoon rode in the second vehicle again. Different driver, Hyun-seok beside him this time, rather than ahead. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Hyun-seok said, without preamble, after this is done, whatever comes after, I want you to know I should have brought you the Sang-jun inference sooner. I made a judgment call about what you were ready to receive, and I was wrong to make it. Do-yoon looked at the city moving past the window. You made the call you thought protected the organization. I made the call that protected you from information you might have acted on before you were positioned to act on it effectively. A pause. Those aren't the same thing, and I knew they weren't. No, Do-yoon said. They're not. He was quiet for a moment. You also kept the organization together for 18 months under conditions that would have fractured most structures. You held the line on every captain who started asking questions. You absorbed Sang-jun's maneuvering without tipping your hand long enough for me to come back before the damage was irreversible. He looked at Hyun-seok. We'll call it even. Hyun-seok nodded once. He looked out his own window. Do-yoon saw the muscle in his jaw release slightly and understood that his consigliere had been carrying that particular weight for some time and was now, in the most functional way available to men like them, setting it down. The building came into view. 8-story commercial structure, legitimate business tenants on floors 1 through 5, the upper floors used for meetings of the kind that didn't appear on official calendars. Do-yoon looked at it through the window and assessed the exterior geometry. Entry points, the positions where the CO exterior team would be placed based on Hyun-seok's intelligence, the vehicle lanes, the sight lines. Contact positions confirmed, he said. Hyun-seok checked his phone. All 9 captains in position. Exterior team has eyes on the CO placement. They're where the intelligence said they'd be. A pause. Do-yoon. The 2 inside the building. I know. You go in first. They have a window before our people can. I know. He looked at Hyun-seok. I'm going in first. Do-yoon. I need every person in that room to see me walk in first. Not surrounded, not managed, not arrive through a side entrance. His voice was very quiet and very final. I need them to see me walk through the front door the same way I walked through every front door for 15 years. Anything less, and the whole message is wrong. Hyun-seok looked at him for a long moment with an expression that contained, in its precise and careful proportions, the full weight of 11 years of working alongside someone you have come to understand is going to make exactly this kind of decision at exactly this kind of moment, and that there is no argument available that will change it, and that the only thing left is to make sure the architecture around the decision is as solid as it can possibly be. 10 seconds, Hyun-seok said. I need 10 seconds after you enter before you move past the lobby. Give our people time to neutralize the service corridor. 10 seconds, Do-yoon said. The vehicle stopped. He got out of the car and the cold morning air hit him immediately. The particular cold of Seoul in the gray season, damp and direct, carrying the smell of the river from somewhere west. He stood on the pavement outside the building's main entrance and did not move for a moment. Not hesitation. Assessment. The exterior, the angles, the distances, the parked vehicles that didn't belong to the building's regular tenants. He could feel the CO team's positioning the way you feel a temperature change, not seen but registered through accumulated attention. He walked toward the entrance, the glass doors, his reflection in them, full, direct, unavoidable. He looked at it for the half second it took to reach the handle, and he looked at the left side of his face and the scarred geography of it in the cold morning light, and he felt nothing about it except that it was his face, and he was walking through this door with it, and that was not a concession or an act of courage. It was simply what was happening. He pushed through the door. The lobby was marble and steel and the particular silence of a space that is waiting. A woman at the reception desk who was not the building's actual receptionist, he clocked that in the first glance, the slight wrongness of her posture, the way her hands were positioned below the desk surface. One of Hyun-seok's people, placed this morning. She looked at him and gave a micro-nod that meant the service corridor had been handled. He counted 10 seconds standing at the lobby center. He didn't pretend to check his phone or study the building directory. He stood and he let the 10 seconds be what they were. Then he walked to the elevator. The third-floor stairwell door opened as he passed it, and two of his captains came through it without urgency, falling into position behind him with the natural ease of men resuming something that had been interrupted rather than beginning something new. One of them, Ryu, who had run the Mappo crew for 6 years and had a habit of cracking his knuckles before anything significant, looked at Do-yoon as they reached the elevator and said nothing. But the look contained something that Do-yoon received and didn't acknowledge and didn't need to. 5th floor. The meeting room was at the end of a corridor that smelled like recycled air and industrial carpet cleaner. 2 doors. The second one. He could hear voices inside. He recognized the register of a room that doesn't know it's about to change. He opened the door. 12 men in the room, 8 were his captains, the 9 minus Ryu, who had come up with him. The remaining 4 were representatives from the Yongsan organization, and beside them, occupying a chair on the room's left side, with the particular relaxed positioning of a man who believes he controls the geometry of the space. Lee Sang-jun. Sang-jun looked up when the door opened. The expression on his face moved through 3 things in approximately 1 second: recognition, recalculation, and then the specific quality of careful neutrality that a man reaches for when he needs time to understand what has changed and what it costs him. He was good at it. Do-yoon had watched him deploy it in negotiations for years and had always assessed it as a professional strength. Now he watched it happen and read it correctly for the first time. Every other person in the room had also looked up. The Yongsan representatives with the calibrated wariness of men who had come expecting a meeting of one kind and were now assessing whether it had become another. His captains with something that was not surprise. They had known he was coming, but was something more immediate than the knowledge. The difference between knowing a thing and being in the room when it happens. Do-yoon walked to the head of the table. He did not rush. He did not perform confidence. He had learned in 15 years of leadership that performed confidence reads as its own kind of weakness, that the real thing moves differently, at its own pace, without reference to how it's being received. He pulled out the chair and sat down and looked at the room. The silence was total. He let it stay total for long enough that everyone in the room stopped waiting for him to break it and simply existed inside it. Then he said, "We'll get to the Yongsan matter shortly." He looked at the Yongsan representatives with the direct attention of someone who intends to resolve their situation cleanly and competently, and is telling them so without words. Then his gaze moved to Sang-jun. "First, I want to hear from Lee Sang-jun about a dinner he attended last week." Sang-jun's face did not move. The man was genuinely good. Do-yoon gave him that. A lesser operator would have shown something. Sang-jun simply looked back at him with the steady attention of someone who is prepared for multiple versions of a difficult conversation and is determining which version this is. "Which dinner?" Sang-jun said. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of someone playing a hand rather than someone folding. "The one where you presented the Seo brothers with a 14-month intelligence summary of this organization's operational movements," Do-yoon said, "and proposed a structural transition that would install you as their logistics director in exchange for delivering everything I've built." The room went very still. The Yongsan representatives were not moving. His captains were not moving. Everyone in the room had just understood that the meeting they'd walked into was not the meeting that had been described to them, and they were now processing whether to act on that understanding or wait to see what the architecture of the next 30 seconds looked like. Sang-jun looked at him for a moment. Then, with the particular decisiveness of a man who has concluded that the cover is gone and that there is only one move remaining, "You've been inside for 18 months. The organization needed leadership that was present. So you tried to give it to the SEO brothers. I tried to ensure continuity." His voice was steady, still playing, still presenting it as something other than what it was. "You weren't coming back. Everyone in this room knew it. I wasn't coming back," Do-yoon said. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that the room instinctively leaned toward. "Tell me about the convoy, Sang-jun." The first crack, almost invisible. A tension at the corner of Sang-jun's jaw that wouldn't have registered to anyone who hadn't spent 7 years watching his face in rooms exactly like this one. "I don't know what you're—" "The route," Do-yoon said. "The night of the convoy. 6 people in the planning meeting. The route decided 4 hours before we moved. The Busan cartel positioned and waiting before we reached the interchange." He paused. One beat. "You were in the room." Sang-jun's hand on the table surface moved, just slightly, just the fingers, a micro-adjustment of position that was not voluntary. Do-yoon watched it happen. "You have no evidence of—" "I have 14 months of communication patterns, a financial exit structure built through my own shell architecture, a contact assessment document in your handwriting that classifies me as irreplaceable, removal only, and a source inside the CO organization who confirmed the timeline of your outreach." Do-yoon's voice remained completely level throughout all of this. He was not performing anger. He did not need to. "The evidence is not the question. The question is whether you're going to tell this room what you did, or whether you're going to make me lay every piece of it on this table in front of the men who have followed both of us." Sang-jun looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes, the calculation completing, the recognition that the hand was not just gone, but had been gone before he walked into the room, that the last piece of maneuvering available to him had already been removed before he'd arrived. He looked at the captains around the table. One of them, Ryu, who had come in through the stairwell, was looking back at him with an expression that contained no ambiguity whatsoever. Sang-jun looked back at Do-yoon. "You were never coming back," he said, and his voice had finally lost the professional steadiness and become something rawer and more honest. "After the fire, I watched you for 6 months. You were gone, not physically, psychologically. Everything that made this organization what it is was gone. I made a decision based on what I saw." "You made a decision," Do-yoon said, "before the fire." The silence that followed that statement was the most complete silence the room had produced, because the accusation was specific and it landed in the room with the weight of something true, and every person present felt the difference between an accusation that is being made and one that is simply being stated. Sang-jun said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Do-yoon stood. "Take him out," he said, and 2 of his captains were moving before the sentence was complete. With the fluid efficiency of men who had been waiting for exactly this instruction and had not needed it repeated. Sang-jun stood, and for one moment his body had the specific tension of a man calculating whether resistance is viable. And then the calculation completed, and he let them take his arms, and he looked at Do-yoon one final time with an expression that was not remorse and not defiance, but something complicated and almost professional, the look of a man who had played a long game and lost it cleanly and was not entirely surprised. They took him out. Do-yoon looked at the Yongsan representatives, who had remained very still throughout all of this, with the excellent situational awareness of men who have survived in difficult environments by correctly identifying which moments require action and which require the patience to wait and see.
What you just witnessed, Do-yoon said, is not a show of force. It's housekeeping.
He sat back down. The Yongsan matter is a legitimate business discussion, and I intend to have it. Whether you still want to have it after this morning is your decision. He looked at the senior representative, a man named Cha, who had the weathered precision of someone who had been navigating these kinds of rooms for 20 years. Cha. Cha looked at him steadily. We're still here, he said.
Then let's begin. The meeting ran 90 minutes. The Yongsan terms were not what the Seo brothers had promised them. The Seo brothers had been offering Yongsan territory that wasn't theirs to offer, predicated on a transition that was not going to happen. Do-yoon laid out the actual parameters with the same precision he had brought to everything operational for 15 years, and Cha listened with the focused attention of someone recalibrating in real time.
And by the end of it, the northern corridors were secured under terms that both organizations could sustain without a war neither of them wanted. When Cha's people left, Do-yoon sat alone in the room for 4 minutes. Then Hyun-seok came back through the door. He stood just inside it and looked at Do-yoon at the head of the table in a room that was now quiet and cleared and smelled like cold coffee and the specific aftermath of a significant thing having just occurred. The exterior team, Do-yoon said, handled all 6. No casualties on our side. A pause. Choi Dong-hwan ran when the exterior moved on the Seo positions. He's in the wind. He won't stay in the wind. No. Hyun-seok came further into the room. The Seo brothers are going to know within the hour that Thursday didn't go the way it was supposed to. Let them know. Do-yoon looked up at him. What they're going to know is that the operation they planned around an absence failed because the absence is over. Let that information move through every channel it wants to move through. I want every organization in this city to receive that information in the next 24 hours. And the Seo brothers themselves. Do-yoon stood. They're going to want a conversation. When they ask for one, they can have one. On our terms, our location, our timeline. He picked up his jacket from the chair back. Right now I need to make a phone call. He walked to the window. The gray sky had not changed. The city below was moving through its Thursday morning with the comprehensive indifference of 10 million people who had their own problems and their own Thursdays to survive. He looked at it and reached for his phone and called Zuri. She answered before the first ring completed. It's done, he said. A silence. He could hear her breathing. Are you hurt? No. Another silence. Longer. He could hear her processing the word done and everything it contained and deciding not to ask for the details right now, which was one of the things about her that had never stopped being one of the things about her. She knew when information needed to wait. Seorin wants to know if she can go home, Zuri said, and there was something in her voice that was almost humor, the specific dry quality of someone releasing tension through a minor complaint on behalf of someone else. Tell her an hour, Do-yoon said. Tell her I said thank you. She'll say you can tell her yourself. I know. A pause. Zuri, I'm here. I'm coming home. A pause. And I need you to call Geneva when I get there. A longer silence. He waited through it. Okay, she said. Her voice had something in it that he hadn't heard in 18 months. Not relief exactly, and not happiness exactly, but the particular quality of a person who has been holding something in place through will alone for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. He hung up and stood at the window and let the gray morning be what it was. Behind him, Hyun-seok was giving instructions to someone on his phone. The building around them was doing what buildings do. Existing, indifferent, holding the space where things had just happened and would continue to hold it after everyone involved had moved on to whatever came next. Do-yoon put on his jacket. He was halfway to the door when Hyun-seok ended his call and said his name with an urgency that stopped him. He turned. Hyun-seok's expression had changed. In 11 years, Do-yoon had learned to read every version of that face, and what he saw now was not the controlled professional concern of a man delivering operational news. It was something else. Choi Dong-hwan didn't run, Hyun-seok said. We just got confirmation of where he went. A pause, and in the pause, the entire weight of the morning shifted. He went to Zuri's office building. He's inside right now, and he was already moving before Hyun-suk finished the sentence. Not running. Something faster than running. The kind of movement that happens when the body stops waiting for instructions from the conscious mind and operates entirely on the older, more direct circuitry that exists beneath thought. He had his phone out and was calling Zuri before he hit the corridor, and the call went to voicemail on the second ring, which meant she was in a meeting or in a building with poor signal, or he shut the thought down with the precision of a man who understands that fear is only useful when it accelerates action and becomes lethal when it replaces it.
Her office, he said to Hyun-suk, who was already 3 steps behind him and already on his own phone. Yoido, 31st floor. The building has 2 main elevators and a service elevator on the north side. Dong-hwan has at least 2 people with him. Our contacts saw them enter through the parking level. Hyun-suk paused. Do-yoon. If he went there, it wasn't improvised. He had this as a contingency.
Do-yoon processed that in the elevator on the way down. Choi Dong-hwan was SEO organization, coordination, not operations. He did not make improvised decisions, which meant that the address of Zuri's office, the building layout, the timing, all of it had been prepared in advance and held in reserve for exactly this scenario. For the scenario where Thursday didn't go as planned and a fallback mechanism was needed, not a hostage situation for negotiation, a fallback mechanism. The distinction turned his blood to something colder than blood. He was in the vehicle and moving before the full weight of it had finished arriving. The gray morning soul moved past the windows at a speed that was slightly above what traffic law permitted, and he sat in the back with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, and Hyun-suk beside him giving clipped instructions over the phone that positioned their available people toward Yoido in converging vectors. "How many can we get inside before Dong-hwan knows we're coming?" Do-yoon said. 2. Maybe 3 if we use the parking level access and come up the service elevator. The building has its own security on the lobby level. They'll be the bottleneck. Get me 2 inside. The rest hold the perimeter and nobody moves without my direct instruction. He paused. Nobody. Do-yoon. If Dong-hwan is there as a fallback and we come in with force, he didn't anticipate. He accelerates whatever he's there to do. We go in quiet. We go in looking like we don't know. You're going in personally. It wasn't a question. Hyun-suk had known him long enough to have stopped asking certain questions. Call the building's head of security, Do-yoon said. Tell him we have a credible threat against one of his tenants. Tell him to keep his people visible and normal and not to move on anything until he hears from me. If he argues, give him your name and tell him the alternative is a situation on the 31st floor that ends his career. Hyun-suk made the call. Do-yoon looked out the window at the Han River as they crossed the bridge, the same dark band of water he had seen from the Mapo office window in the small hours of the morning. Different angle, different light, the same river, and breathed through the particular discipline of keeping fear functional rather than paralyzing. He tried Zuri again. Voicemail again. He tried her assistant. The assistant answered on the first ring and her voice was wrong, too tight, too careful. The voice of someone in a room where the acoustics have changed. "This is Kang Do-yoon," he said. "I need you to tell me if Ms. Adebayo Kong is currently in her office." A pause. Just a half second. Yes, she's in a meeting. I can take a message. Is there anyone with her who is not a member of her regular legal team? Another pause. Longer. And in the length of it, he had everything he needed. I'm not sure Listen to me carefully, he said. I need you to leave your desk right now. Walk to the bathroom. Lock the door. Do not come out until a uniformed building security officer knocks and tells you his name. Do you understand? A small sound, then, yes. Go now. He hung up. She's on the floor, he said to Hyun-suk. Dong-hwan is already with her. The vehicle was 4 minutes from the building. They came in through the parking level. Do-yoon, Hyun-suk, and 2 men whose names were Tae and Wook and who had been with the organization for 8 and 6 years respectively, and who moved through the concrete parking structure with the efficient quiet of people who understood the requirements of confined spaces. The service elevator required a key that the building's head of security had provided via Hyun-suk's phone call, a man named Park, who had listened to the situation summary with the controlled professionalism of a former law enforcement officer and had decided correctly that his best outcome was cooperation. The service elevator was slow. The 31 floors took 90 seconds. Do-yoon stood in the metal box and looked at the floor indicator and breathed and kept his mind on the geometry of the 31st floor. The layout he had reconstructed from Hyun-seok's description and his own knowledge of the building, which he had been to twice for legal consultations through one of his legitimate companies. Corner office. 2 approaches from the main corridor. 1 interior conference room visible through glass. Reception area with her assistant's desk positioned between the elevator bank and the office suite's main entrance. The doors opened. The service corridor smelled like cleaning supplies and the particular institutional air of a floor where the public-facing surfaces were high-end and the back-of-house infrastructure was purely functional. Do-yoon moved into it with Tae and Wook flanking him and Hyun-seok a step behind, and they came through the service door into the main corridor, and it was empty. Empty meant Dong-hwan had already consolidated. He wasn't using the corridor, he was inside the office suite. Do-yoon stopped Tae and Wook with a hand gesture and looked at Hyun-seok. "I go in alone," he said. Hyun-seok's expression went through something complex and then resolved into the particular compressed acceptance of a man who has reached the limit of his ability to argue. Tae and Wook at the entrance. "You go for 5 minutes and then we're coming in regardless." 10. 7. Do-yoon looked at him. 7, he said. He walked to the entrance of the office suite. Glass door, closed but unlocked. He could see through it into the reception area. The assistant's desk was empty. Beyond it, the door to the main office corridor was open. He could see the edge of Zuri's office door, which was also open, and in the light that came from it, he could see the shadow of at least 2 people. He pushed through the glass door. The reception area was quiet. His footsteps on the carpet were almost nothing. He moved through the open corridor door and down the short hall and stopped in the doorway of Zuri's office. 3 people. Zuri, seated at her desk with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided that whatever is happening, she will not give it the satisfaction of her fear. Her hands flat on the desk surface, her back straight, her face arranged in the expression Do-yoon recognized as the one she wore in adversarial proceedings, which was the expression of a woman who is cataloging everything and giving away nothing. Beside her desk, slightly behind her, a man he didn't recognize, one of Dong-hwan's, standing with the tense readiness of someone waiting for instruction, and across the desk from Zuri, in the chair that clients used, Choi Dong-hwan. Dong-hwan was 53, broad, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent displeasure over decades of operating in difficult situations. He was not holding anything. He didn't need to. The man behind Zuri was the instrument. Dong-hwan was the decision. He looked up when Do-yoon appeared in the doorway. He looked and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, because he was too experienced for visible surprise, but the specific recalibration of a man who had built a contingency around an assumption and has just discovered the assumption was wrong. The assumption being that Do-yoon, upon learning that Dong-hwan was here, would send people first and arrive later, or not at all. "Close the door," Dong-hwan said. Do-yoon looked at Zuri. She looked back at him. In the look was everything. She was not hurt. She was not broken. She was furious in the contained way. She was furious about things that mattered. And underneath the fury, she was watching him with the complete attention of someone who trusts the person who just walked in and is ready to move when the geometry of the room changes. He closed the door. He came to the desk and stood beside Zuri, between her and Dong-hwan, with the man behind her in his peripheral vision at all times. "Sit down," Dong-hwan said. "I'll stand." A pause. "Thursday didn't go the way it was supposed to." "No," Do-yoon said. "Sang-jun is being dealt with." Dong-hwan looked at him with the assessing attention of a man recalculating in real time. "I want to know your terms." "You came to my wife's office to ask me for terms." "I came to your wife's office because the alternative was disappearing, and I'm too old to disappear effectively." His voice was flat and direct, stripped of the performative aggression that most men in his position would have reached for. "I have information about the convoy that Sang-jun didn't give you. Information about who commissioned it and what the full original plan was and who else in your organization has been on payroll for the past 2 years. He paused. "I'll trade it." "For what?" "Safe passage out of Seoul.
My people get immunity from whatever you're planning to do with the CO organization structure. And you forget my name. Do-yoon looked at him steadily. You thought coming here gave you leverage.
Coming here gave me a conversation I wouldn't have gotten any other way. Dong-hwan's eyes were steady. I'm not a threat to her. I want you to know that. I came here because it's the one address I had that I knew you'd come to personally instead of sending people. A pause. I needed you in a room. I needed you to hear what I'm offering before you decided what to do about me. The man behind my wife is here because I needed you to take this meeting seriously. Dong-hwan looked at the man and gave a small nod. The man behind Zuri stepped back, not out of the room, but 2 steps back, which was its own kind of statement. Zuri's hands on the desk surface moved fractionally. She was still watching Do-yoon. He could feel it without looking at her. Talk, Do-yoon said. Dong-hwan talked. It took 11 minutes. Do-yoon stood and listened with the concentrated stillness of someone receiving intelligence and processing it in real time against everything he already knew. The convoy, Sang-jun, the 14 months of operational leakage, the financial structure. What Dong-hwan provided were the pieces that hadn't been in Cho's forensics or Hyun-seok's intelligence, because they were the pieces that existed only in the conversations between Dong-hwan and the Seo brothers about what Sang-jun had told them before it became operational. 2 more names inside Do-yoon's organization. Mid-level, but positioned in ways that had made them useful as passive information sources for Sang-jun's intelligence gathering. Neither of them had known the full picture. Sang-jun had been careful to keep each node isolated, but both had been feeding small operational details that had accumulated into the pattern Cho had identified in the communication logs. And one detail about the convoy that changed the shape of everything. The original plan, the plan that Sang-jun had commissioned through back channels to the Busan cartel, had not been for the ambush to kill Do-yoon cleanly. It had been staged specifically to look like a rival operation, but with a secondary mechanism. One of the vehicles had been modified. The fuel line on the 3rd car had not failed naturally under the explosion's heat. It had been prepared to rupture under specific conditions, designed to ensure that if the initial ambush was survived, the fire would complete what the ambush started. Which meant that the fire that had burned the left side of his face and body, that had taken 18 months of his life, that had driven him behind closed curtains and into a penthouse that became a prison, had been not a consequence of the ambush, but a designed feature of it. Sang-jun had not tried to kill him with bullets and accepted the fire as a byproduct. He had planned for the fire specifically because he understood Do-yoon well enough to know that a man who runs toward burning cars might survive an ambush but could be destroyed by what the fire left behind. He had tried to use Do-yoon's own character against him twice, once with the fire itself, and once by calculating that the psychological damage from the fire would accomplish what the fire hadn't. Do-yoon absorbed this standing at his wife's desk in her 31st floor office with the gray Seoul sky visible through the floor-to-ceiling window behind her, and he let it settle into him with the complete and undefended attention of a man who is done protecting himself from true things. He looked at Zuri. He was looking at him. She had heard everything Dong-hwan had said, and she was looking at her husband's face, both sides of it, the way she always did. And her expression was not pity, and it was not horror, and it was not the performance of strength. It was the face of someone who has just received a piece of information that recontextualizes something they have been living with and is absorbing the recontextualization with the full weight of what it costs. He looked back at Dong-hwan. The 2 names, he said. I want written confirmation. Everything you told me in a form that can be verified. I can give you that. You'll give it to the man outside this door before you leave this building. After it's verified, you get your passage. He paused. The immunity for your people is conditional on none of them surfacing in Seoul's operational landscape for a minimum of 3 years. They surface. The condition expires retroactively. Dong-hwan looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. A single clean movement. The nod of a man who has concluded a negotiation under difficult circumstances and is acknowledging the terms with the professionalism of someone who understands he received better than he had any right to expect. One more thing, Do-yoon said. The Seo brothers. What about them? They built an operation around the premise that I was finished. They commissioned a plan to make sure of it and then spent 14 months building a transition structure on that foundation. He looked at Dong Hwan steadily. They're going to want to recalibrate when they understand that the foundation is gone. When they reach out, and they will reach out, you tell them that the conversation they want to have is available, but the terms are mine. Dong Hwan stood. He was a large man, and standing made him larger, and Do-yoon watched him do it without adjustment. You know, Dong Hwan said, when the Seo brothers first made contact with Sung-jun, I told them the plan wouldn't work. Why? Because I'd seen you operate for 15 years, and I knew the difference between a man who was finished and a man who was between things. He looked at Do-yoon's face, not in the way that most people looked, with the self-conscious awareness of what they were looking at, but with the direct attention of someone making a professional assessment. Sung-jun knew you well enough to build a plan that almost worked. He didn't know you well enough to understand that almost is a very specific kind of failure when it comes to you. Basmapulstein. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the handle. Mrs. Kang, he said, I'm sorry for the disruption. Zuri looked at him with the steady attention of someone choosing their words with great care. Leave, she said. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. The room was very quiet. Do-yoon looked at Zuri, and Zuri looked at Do-yoon, and for a moment neither of them moved because the moment after a thing like that has its own requirements. A stillness that is not emptiness, but the necessary space between the end of one thing and the beginning of whatever comes next. Then Zuri stood up from her desk and came around it and stopped in front of him, close. She reached up and put her hand on the left side of his face, the scarred geography of it, the tightened skin of the graft, the eye that didn't open quite as wide. Her palm was warm and her hand was steady, and she held it there with the directness of a woman who has made this gesture before and means it the same way every time. He put his hand over hers. The fire, she said quietly. She wasn't asking for confirmation. She had heard everything. She was naming it, putting language around it, doing what she did with difficult things, bringing them into the light where they could be looked at directly. Yes, he said. She breathed. He felt her hand move slightly under his, not pulling away. Something else. Something that was absorbing the weight of what yes meant. That the scars were not the incidental cost of a rival's attack, but the deliberate design of a man he had trusted completely. That the 18 months of curtains and mirrors and retreating silence had been, in some specific and terrible sense, exactly what the plan had intended. He wanted you to disappear, she said. He almost got what he wanted. Almost, she said, with the precise weight that Dong Hwan had just given the word, and something in the repetition of it moved through him differently than he expected, not with the professional satisfaction of a man who has survived a threat, but with something rawer and less manageable. The feeling of a man who is finally allowing himself to understand how close the distance had been between the life he had been living in that penthouse and the life he had nearly stopped having altogether. He took her hand from his face and held it. Both hands now, hers between his. I need you to know something, he said. What I said last night about Geneva, I wasn't releasing you because I felt guilty. I was releasing you because I looked at what you'd done for 18 months and I understood that I had been taking a person's future and calling it love. His voice was very quiet, not broken, just stripped of everything that wasn't true. That stops now. Whatever you need to build back what you put on hold, you have it, all of it. I will be the person who makes sure of it instead of the person you make sure of. Why so much it? Zuri looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying and would not cry here, not because the feeling wasn't present, but because this was not the kind of moment she wept through. She processed things fully and wept later, privately, and he had known that about her for years and loved it the way you love the specific true shape of another person. You were never just something I made sure of, she said. Don't rewrite it into that. I made choices because I love you. And they were my choices to make. She paused. But yes, Geneva, and the Nairobi proceedings if they'll still have me, and the fellowship. She paused again. All of it, he said. She looked at him, both sides of his face in the gray window light, and then she stepped forward and rested her forehead against his jaw, the left side, the scarred side, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in her office on the 31st floor while Seoul went on being Seoul beneath them. The structural work took 3 months. The two names Dong Hwan had provided were handled with the particular care that Do Yoon applied to situations where the people involved were not architects of the betrayal, but instruments of it. Neither of them had understood the full scope of what Sang Jun had been using their information for. And that distinction mattered, because Do Yoon had spent 15 years building an organization where distinction mattered, where the distance between complicity and coercion was taken seriously rather than collapsed for convenience. They were removed from their positions. They were given clear terms. They were watched. Lee Sang-jun was a separate and more complete reckoning. The documentation that Cho had assembled and Dong Hwan had corroborated was sufficient for a referral to the Federal Organized Crime Division, a conversation that Hyun Seok managed through channels that had been carefully maintained over years, precisely for the moments when the organization's internal mechanisms were insufficient for a problem scale. The federal case took 4 months to build, and Do Yoon was not directly involved in its public elements. He didn't need to be. He had learned, somewhere in the past year, that justice and presence are not always the same requirement. Sang-jun's last communication with Do Yoon was a single phone call, made after the federal referral had been confirmed and before the legal proceedings began. Do Yoon took it because not taking it would have been its own kind of avoidance, and he had committed to being done with avoidance. "I underestimated what you'd choose," Sang-jun said. He sounded tired, not remorseful. Do Yoon did not expect remorse and would not have trusted it. Just tired, the exhaustion of a man at the end of a long and ultimately failed effort. "You underestimated what I'd choose twice," Do Yoon said, "with the convoy and with the 18 months after it. The first was a calculated risk. The second—" a pause. "The second I genuinely believed. I watched you for 6 months after the hospital, and I believed it." "I know," Do Yoon said. "That's the part that's going to stay with you." He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and let the full length of 7 years run through him. The work, the trust, the particular closeness of working alongside someone whose competence you rely on completely, all of it recontextualized now. All of it carrying the specific grief of discovering that something you thought was real was a performance. Not because the competence had been false, but because the foundation beneath it had been. Sang-jun had been genuinely good at what he did. He had also been planning Do Yoon's removal for potentially longer than either of them fully knew. Both things were true simultaneously, and the simultaneity was the part that couldn't be resolved neatly. He put the phone down and went to find Zuri. Uchinek. She came back from Geneva in October. He was at the airport, not with a driver, not with security, just him in a car he drove himself, which he had been doing more since Thursday, reclaiming the ordinary mobility of a person who moves through the city rather than above it. He stood in the arrivals hall with the general population of people waiting for people, and when she came through the gate with her laptop bag over her shoulder and the specific quality of alert exhaustion that came from 20 hours of travel following 3 weeks of intensive proceedings, she saw him immediately, and her face did something that he had been carrying in his chest since the morning she had left. She walked to him and he took her bag without being asked, and she looked at his face the way she always did. "How did it go?" he said. "Standing ovation," she said, with the dry precision of someone delivering information they're still processing. "Which I did not expect." "I expected it." She looked at him. "Did you?" "I've read your work," he said. "I've always read your work," is read. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the full attention that was one of the specific things about her, the quality of being seen by her that had never stopped being one of the most significant experiences of his adult life. "You never told me that," she said. "I told you in other ways." "Tell me in words sometimes," she said. "I'm a lawyer. I work in language." "Noted," he said, and they walked out of the airport into the October Seoul night together. The vow renewal was Seorin's idea, which she presented not as a suggestion, but as a scheduled fact, which was how she presented most things she had already decided on. The garden of the restaurant where they had first met, a small, private space behind a building in Insadong that had been there for 40 years and looked it, which was a quality Do Yoon had always appreciated in places, the honesty of showing their age. 14 people. Hyun Seok,
who arrived early and stood at the garden's edge looking at the fairy lights strung in the tree branches with the slightly undone expression of a man who has maintained professional composure for 11 consecutive years and is finding the occasion unexpectedly difficult. Ryu, who had brought his wife and spent the first 20 minutes talking to Zuri's Nigerian colleague, who had flown in from Lagos with the focused intensity of a man attempting to make a favorable impression through sheer effort of will. Seo Rin, who had organized everything and was now standing apart from it with the satisfied attention of someone watching a mechanism she has built operate correctly.
Doyun and Zuri stood in the center of the garden and said things to each other that they had said before in a different form, in a different city, in the earlier version of themselves that had not yet survived what they had survived. He said, "I will not hide from you behind anything, not scars, not silence, not the particular pride of a man who has spent 15 years constructing a self that needed no one. I choose to need you, which is different from the alternative and more honest." She said, "I will keep choosing you, not the man the city fears, not the legend, not the version of you that exists in other people's calculations, the man who ran toward the burning car because he had decided someone was worth running toward. That man, I will keep choosing him." They had not prepared what they said. It came out of whatever had been accumulating during the months of reconstruction, his, hers, the organizational work, the Geneva proceedings, the 3 months of slow, deliberate repair to the structure of their daily life that had been quietly dismantled during 18 months of curtains and distance. Seorin was crying, which she would deny to her grave. Hyun-seok was looking at the tree branches, which Do-yoon noticed and noted and said nothing about. After, there was food and the specific warmth of a small gathering of people who have earned their presence at an occasion. Not guests, but witnesses. People whose knowledge of the difficulty gives them the right to be present for the thing the difficulty produced. At one point, Do-yoon was standing at the garden's edge, and Hyun-seok came to stand beside him, and they stood there the way they had stood in many rooms in many difficult moments, and looked at the gathering and were quiet for a while. The Seo brothers reached out. Hyun-seok said finally, "I know. The terms you proposed. They'll accept them," Do-yoon said. "They don't have a better option, and they're pragmatic enough to know it." A pause. "And after that?" Do-yoon looked at his consigliere of 11 years. "After that, we build something that doesn't require a man to be willing to disappear in order to hold together." A pause. "I've been thinking about what Song-joon said, that he made a decision about what the organization needed when leadership wasn't present. He was wrong about the decision, but he wasn't wrong that the structure created the condition." He looked back at the gathering. "We fixed the structure." Hyun-seok was quiet for a moment. "That's a longer conversation." "We have time," Do-yoon said. Across the garden, Zuri was talking to Seorin with the animated directness she brought to conversations about things she found genuinely interesting. Her hands moving, her face lit with the specific aliveness of a person who is fully inhabiting the moment they're in. She looked up, some instinct, some awareness, and found him across the garden and held his gaze for a moment with the direct, unperformed attention that he had been the recipient of for 6 years. He held it back. She smiled, not the social smile she wore in professional rooms, but the other one, smaller and more real, the one that was for him, and looked back at Seo-rin. Do-yoon looked at the garden, the lights in the trees, the 14 people who had earned their presence here, the October air cool against both sides of his face, the left and the right, the scarred and the unscarred, the face he had spent 18 months hiding from the light. He had not stopped being aware of it. He did not think he ever would entirely, and he had made a separate peace with that, with the fact that surviving something does not require pretending the cost was small. The scars were there. They would always be there. What had changed was not their presence, but the decision he made about what they were permitted to mean. They were the record of a night when he had decided someone was worth running toward. That was what they were. That was all they were. He picked up his glass from the small table beside him. 6 months later, Zuri stood before an international legal summit in The Hague and presented the research she had spent 4 years building toward and 3 more developing through everything that had happened since. The paper concerned the legal obligations of organizations, corporate, civic, and otherwise, to the individuals caught in the machinery of institutional conflict. It It was precise and rigorous, and occasionally, in the passages where theory gave way to the more immediate texture of what these situations cost actual people, it was devastating. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. The first call she made afterward was to Do-yoon, who answered from Seoul where it was 3 in the morning and who had been awake because he had known, within a reasonable approximation, what time the session ended. 4 minutes, he said, which meant he had already received Seorin's text. You've been talking to your sister. She was tracking it. A pause. She was in a corridor outside the main hall. He could hear the echoing marble of it, and he imagined her leaning against the wall with her laptop bag and the specific exhausted aliveness of someone who has just done something they spent years preparing to do. Come home, he said. 2 more days, she said. There are follow-up sessions. Come home after 2 more days. Yes, she said. After 2 more days. He hung up and set the phone on the table beside the bed and lay in the dark of the bedroom where the curtains were open now, where the Seoul skyline came in through the glass and made the ceiling into something that moved and breathed with the city's light. He had not closed the curtains in 4 months. He did not miss having them closed. The city outside was doing what it always did, running, pressing, generating the compressed noise of 10 million lives pushing against each other in a modern space. And he lay in the middle of it at 3 in the morning and felt its weight and presence the way you feel the weight and presence of something you have always belonged to, that was always going to be there when you were ready to come back. He had been ready for a while now. He closed his eyes. He slept.